That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd John's Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd John's Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd John's Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd John's Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. All right, welcome to That's Enough Out of You. I'm your host, Bill Rader, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Sean Kane. Sean, what's going on?
Billy Braids, how you doing, buddy?
I'm a little under the
weather.
Yeah, I don't know if you could tell from my voice, but I sound a lot better than I did when I woke up. Woke up this morning and I thought, how am I going to do a podcast today? But I will. I'm going to stay out of this one. I will keep my talk to a minimum. But we will. I'll kind of hand it over to you, Sean. But we have a great guest, a returning guest. Friend of the podcast and great author and a great guest on our show, and that is Mr. Rick Otto. Rick, how you doing?
How you doing, Bill? How you doing, Sean? It's great
Rick,
to be back, and I always appreciate and enjoy our conversations.
We do as well, buddy. And we got a good show today. A lot of things I want to get into. We're going to talk about the assassination programs and drone assassination program and, a Civil War to 60s. But Rick, let's start it off with, because we got the 60th anniversary of JFK coming up. Let's just talk for a few minutes about, JFK's vision and the importance of his death with the 60th anniversary coming up.
Yeah. You had on a terrific guest a little while ago, Monica Wycheck, who focused on our energy on trying to refocus who President Kennedy really was, and I think she did a really good job.
She did.
Basically, she said she was the last American president that was looking out for the average citizen.
Right.
And she went about showing how he took on the pharmaceutical industry, the chemical industry, the medical industry, and he was trying to make the FDA and CDC and all the government agencies work for the American people, something that they're not doing right now. And we need all kinds of reforms. But and she also pointed out what he was doing in terms of his foreign policy. And he was really the last president that had a vision for this country that was consistent with our founding principles to a large extent. And because the common narrative that has been promoted since his death is that his death was actually occurred because of things that he was doing, and it was blowback.
Yes.
And he basically was a compromised president that was dangerous and reckless, and he really wasn't that much of a visionary. He was all, to paraphrase that famous book he wrote, Profiles and Courage, he was all profile and no courage. Well, what we've learned since, and what I discovered in my research, because as Monica pointed out, if you watch his speeches or you listen to his press conferences, and I've done this hours and hours and hours, and I've watched all his famous speeches. I've watched many of his press conferences. And I think one of the best ones to watch if you want to watch the highlights of his press conferences is something that was narrated by Eugene Marshall called "Thank You, Mr. President." And I think the way he thought on his feet, the quick wit he had, the intelligence he had. I mean, many of the people he met with, for example, that were leaders from foreign countries said that they were so impressed. He seemed to know more about their history than they did. So he was a very unusual person, and he was one of the best read presidents we've ever had. He was one of the best historical presidents we ever had. He understood history, and he understood the consequences of making a bad decision as being a leader of a very powerful country. And I think that all the research I've engaged in kind of confirmed what a lot of his close aides and friends would write about, that he was a very well-read individual, that he cared about the American people, that he became extremely upset when he thought people were suffering. And he was very in tune with his position of being president of the United States. He agreed with Harry Truman's assessment that about 10 to 15% of the American public have the ability to meet and lobby their congressman or their senator, and it's up to the president to represent the other and lobby for the other 85%. And he not only agreed with that, he did that in everything he did. He lobbied for the American people, whether it was Medicare, civil rights, or seeking peace. And he anguished over every death that occurred in Vietnam. He was not a cold-hearted, callous person. He was actually a very compassionate, caring person. And that's the real President Kennedy. And the fact that he was so charismatic and was able to inspire so many people is what made him a danger to the deep state and the people like the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Bushes, the Nixons, the Dulles brothers, because he was inspiring so many people to view America the way he wanted it to be viewed, and to go in the direction, his vision, which basically, if I can quickly, Donald Gibson talks about this in his great book, Battling Wall Street. I highly recommend.
Tremendous book. I love that book.
Yeah, it really lays out
yes,
the fact that Kennedy admired Franklin Roosevelt, and he heard Roosevelt when Roosevelt, in his final State of the Union speech, said that he wanted to propose a second Bill of Rights. I want to make this country so that the average worker in this country has a right to a job, a right to a home, and a right to health care. And to think about that, he's saying that in 1944. In a country whose basic tenets are militarism and capitalism, the same things that Dr. King, we will discuss later on, challenged. And he not only was talking about that vision, as Donald Gibson points out, he was actually putting together a plan to achieve those goals through his augmenting of Social Security, his augmenting of aid for dependent children by creating the AFDC, by his making it people able to retire at 62, not just 65, and his strong support for Social Security, Medicaid, and his proposal of Medicare, which unfortunately didn't get passed while he was alive. It was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. And of course, we know that we now know that he was, and many of us knew for a long time, but I think a lot of people are coming around that denied it, like Glenn Greenwald, the great journalist, even Chris Hedges, finally decided to read a book, a real good book on the Kennedys and their views and their assassination. He finally took the time to read David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard, and he is now convinced that, and believe it or not, Chris Hedges finally, he read Professor Jeffrey Sachs' book, and the importance of this is Chris Hedges is a Nobel Prize journalist who was a correspondent for many years for the New York Times and has become and he's a follower of Noam Chomsky and Seymour Hersh. And of course, we all know how Noam Chomsky and Seymour Hersh, for some reason, when it comes to the Kennedys, they completely lie about them.
Yeah, they're terrible on the subject. Terrible.
But he's broken with them. He finally, for the first time, can you believe this? A Pulitzer Prize winning journalist finally listened to the whole speech by John Kennedy, American University, on June 10th, 1960, and he was amazed what he said. He said it was the best speech he'd ever listened to. He can't believe Kennedy said it. And then, of course, he read David Talbot's book. So he's totally a convert now. He's an admirer of President Kennedy, and he believes he was killed by a domestic conspiracy.
That's
so
amazing.
I think everybody is coming around to the fact that he was killed by a domestic conspiracy. It involved high-ranking members of the CIA and the military. And in fact, I believe General Curtis LeMay had foreknowledge of the event, why he was smoking his victory cigar at the autopsy. And I think other deep state actors knew about it as well. They knew something was going to happen, and the rest of the government covered it up so that we didn't look like a banana republic, and to try to protect either the integrity of their agencies like J. Edgar Hoover or the integrity of the government.
And a lot of them too, Rick, they were, they covered up. They weren't complicit in the actual assassination, but they were afraid of the World War III because the CIA was planting a lot of evidence blaming the Russians and the Cubans and hinting that a World War III would be possible down the road. So, a lot of people went in that direction where they would just cover it up because they were afraid of that angle. But I wanted to interject, Rick, on a couple of things you said there. You talked about, the character assassination against Kennedy. That was by design. And a lot of these guys, fed into it in academia and in the media, and they kept it going. And you talk about Chomsky, he's one of the worst. But it's interesting to hear that on Hedges coming around, because it would be great to see a lot of these guys come around and actually tell the truth about John Kennedy, because we had Don McGovern episode is up right now on our podcast is published, and he talked about, all the Marilyn Monroe stuff and how so much of it is just garbage, and a lot of it is just exaggerated and taken to these lengths of, because they wanted to paint John Kennedy as a guy who was soulless and a womanizer and tied to the mafia and doing drugs and all this other stuff. And people wouldn't look into his death and wouldn't ask the questions of why he was killed. But like you said, Rick, Monica Wiesack did a great job in her book and pointing out who John Kennedy really was. And then the other book you mentioned, Donald Gibson's Battling Wall Street, it shows you what Kennedy was up against, because you understand that all these guys are connected, all these players, the Rockefellers, and you see where, like, Mary Bancroft's father is a high-ranking banker tied to the Rockefellers, and she's hanging out with Ruth Paine, who befriends Oswald. And you see everything is connected, how the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and all these families are connected into intelligence, like C.D. Jackson and Allen Dulles, and all these guys are tied in together. And you just saw what Kennedy, that book points out what Kennedy was up against. He was battling Wall Street, and he was battling what's called the Eastern Establishment.
Well, what we're going to talk about later about the attack on the left in the 60s and the Civil War that occurred, that I spent some time on, either directly or indirectly, in The Hidden War, which is my last volume. Essentially, Kennedy believed that we were an exemplary nation, and that, as Donald Gibson said, he wanted to make sure that America maintained its standing in the world and had influence, and that our economy was top of the line. But that did not mean that he wanted everyone else to be suppressed or oppressed, or basically that we were enforcing, as he said, a Pax Americana on the rest of the world by our weapons of war. He wanted to help the other nations achieve a certain standard of living for their people as well, and encourage them to follow our lead as we fulfilled our vision and reached what Dr. King called the Promised Land. And so he was trying to do both. He was trying to help other nations achieve their objectives, as he was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that's why he was so upset when he heard that Patrice Lumumba from Adlai Stevenson had been assassinated. That's why he was so upset when he heard that Dag Hammarskjöld had been assassinated. And that's why he wanted to rebuild his relationships with African countries. He wanted to support this movement called nationalism, which Eisenhower called it a dangerous hurricane and was trying to suppress it. So he was trying to change the orthodoxies that many of the deep state and many of people in our secret government believed in. He was trying to change the course. It was basically his vision of an exemplary nation versus the vision of many of the neocons and neoliberals of us being an exceptional nation, that because of our founding, we had a right to exploit the resources and labor of other countries, and they had to follow our lead because we earned that right. And he wanted to participate in with these countries and help them become independent. And he wanted a world of law, and he was willing to accept diversity.
Yeah, and after Kennedy, Rick, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, they would totally reverse Kennedy's direction and really go back to closer to the way it was under Eisenhower, and go back to that pro-imperialism.
They reasserted that
Yes.
idea that we were building an empire and that we were an exceptional nation. Now, we had détente under Nixon, but it was a different type of détente than what Khrushchev and Kennedy had contemplated. Khrushchev and Kennedy came to that because, as he said, that peace was the end of rational men. And it was something that we had to pursue because of the dangers of our new weapons and the hazards they posted to not just the Soviet Union and the United States, but to everyone, wherever they lived. And they had come to the realization that they had to accept some of their differences and to get along and to help build a world that was safe for diversity. Nixon and Kissinger and Brezhnev were basically coming to an agreement that was more based on Machiavellian aspects as opposed to forming a real connection and understanding of each other. As Kennedy said, we had to acknowledge our own views about and our own attitudes about peace. And we had to realize that the Soviet people, and we had to give them credit for their efforts in World War II, that 27 million people died fighting the Nazis. And they took on 200 divisions.
Right.
And a third of their country was burnt to the ground. And so it was a totally different type of détente that he was trying to seek than the one that was eventually done by Nixon.
Absolutely. So Rick, let's get into before we get into the assassination programs and we get into the war on the left, the Civil War, like you call it in your book. Tell the story about your uncle that was working junior Navy officer.
Yeah, my uncle was a mathematical genius. I would say he saw mathematics as a language, and he knew how to speak it fluently. And he was an aerial photographic expert. He was very good at analyzing photographs and determining what you were looking at from very high altitudes. And in those days, the photographs that they usually received were from U-2 planes that flew at about 60,000 feet. And he originally was stationed at the Fleet Intelligence Center in Europe, in Morocco, and then he was transferred to a small naval unit called the Atlantic Intelligence Center that was part of the Second Fleet Command of Admiral Dennison. And his immediate commander was a highly decorated Air Force captain named H.A. Kelly. And they were stationed in this very small space that consisted of 3 rooms that used to be a hospital that had long been shut down. And they were called the Green Onion, which apparently referred to these 2 cipher-locked green doors that were the only ways to get in and out of that highly classified naval unit. And essentially, just to lay down the context, for many decades, the CIA took the credit for discovering the missiles in Cuba, and the National Photographic Interpretation Center, which was basically run under the auspices of the Central Intelligence Agency. But the reality was it was actually this small group working for a naval unit called the Atlantic Intelligence Center. And what happened is that the way it was set up is that the Technical Support Center would get these U-2 negatives, these photographs taken by U-2 pilots, and then as they were spooled off into pictures, they would send them out. The first group would go to the NPIC and the CIA, and the second group would go to this naval unit, the AIC. And on October 15th, Joe Parker went up and got all these cans that would be of pictures, and they would be divvied out to the analysts. And my uncle was part of that. And what happened is that one of his colleagues, Lieutenant Dick Helfrich, noted something that he said looked suspicious, like a Super S site, and he wasn't competent to really analyze it any further, so he asked my uncle if he'd look at it. And my uncle noted that there were about 7 long objects that looked like missiles. And he went to the Army handbook and started looking at pictures that were basically of Soviet missiles that, would be paraded in the annual May Day parade, which was their celebration of the great patriotic war in World War II and the defeating of the Nazis. And they had these big parade in Moscow, and they would show off all their new weapons. And he started measuring them and realized that they were a few feet too short. And then he realized that they didn't have, he wasn't including the nuclear weapon that would be attached to the front of the missile. And once he did that, he realized they matched perfectly. It was the same length. And he went across the hall to Captain H. Kelly, who was their leader, and he said, I think I found some proof that the Soviets are actually putting MRBMs inside of Cuba. And he said, are you sure this is what you found? Because if you're wrong, it's going to be our asses handed to us. And he said he was a very cocky man, and I can believe this. My uncle was kind of, his personality bordered on arrogance to a certain extent. And he was a very big guy. He was 6 foot. Some people say he was 6'5", others say he was 6'7", but my mom was convinced he was 6'7", so that's what I put in the book. So he kind of intimidated me as a child, and he had this kind of a rough personality, but nevertheless, he said, he was a cocky guy, and he believed he got it, and he wasn't worried about what would happen to his career because he was sure he was right. And so his boss forwarded it on through the MPIS CIA channels, and it ended up on Kennedy's desk the next day, and that was the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he received a medal and certification for his fine work in the AIC from February of 1962 until December of 1962.
Wow, that's amazing stuff there, Rick. Amazing story.
What is even more amazing is this captain who was part of the 18th Airborne Paratrooper Division. He would meet with him occasionally, and they discussed, because he was supposed to jump down the paratroop if they were going to invade, and if Kennedy had followed the advice of the generals, they were going to invade. They were going to be paratrooped into a field southwest of Havana, and he came back to get a final report after the crisis was over, and they were looking at the photographs where they were expected to land, and they found all these ASU-57 armored vehicles with self-propelled guns under the canopy of trees there. And to show you what kind of military equipment they were. They would be similar to the Bradleys we have today. And essentially, they would have been paratrooping over top of these things that would be operated by elite combat troops. They would have been decimated if they had done that. And Robert McNamara, just quickly, at the 30th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he attended a conference that was attended by a lot of Soviet military personnel that had participated in that seminal event. And they talked about all the tactical nuclear weapons they had and that they were willing to use them. At the time, McNamara, when they were doing the XCOM meetings, he had told Kennedy that he thought if they had invaded Cuba, that they would have lost, there have been 15,000 deaths and countless casualties, of course. And he said that based on what he learned at that conference, if he had known that at the time, he would have told Kennedy that there would have been 100,000 U.S. Troop deaths. And of course, that meant that the whole thing would have just gotten completely out of control very rapidly and out of the control of the civilian leaders, and we would have been facing Armageddon. So the fact that Khrushchev and Kennedy came up with a peaceful solution, basically, it is not hyperbole to say that they basically saved the world.
Absolutely. And put in RFK because he did a lot of the legwork there in the back channeling.
Yes, he negotiated with them. They wanted to take out the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Greece, Italy and Greece, or Turkey rather. They were kind of, they were land-based missiles. They were easy targets, and they were being replaced by the nuclear sub-Polaris missiles that were much easier to hide from your adversary. And so he contemplated taking them out anyway before the crisis. But when the crisis occurred, made it clear that to him, and Kennedy believed that one of the reasons he took this great gamble was because we had missiles in Italy and Turkey. Why can't he have missiles in Cuba? And he was trying to give us a taste of our own medicine. So Kennedy, through Robert Kennedy, in their discussions with Dobrynin, basically said that we can't make this part of the agreement, but 6 months after the resolution of the crisis, we will take the missiles out. And when Kennedy did that, Khrushchev said, hey, we can trust this guy. And that's what he told Castro. He said, we can trust him. And then Castro began his back channel negotiations based on that as well.
Right. So Rick, let's get into the origins of the assassination programs and how this mess started. Let's get into the beginnings.
Well, of course, many secret police or organizations say assassination has been part of their protocol for forever. But in our country, most of the public and media and even our leaders didn't want us to get involved in such activities. But in World War II, the Office of Strategic Services obviously engaged in a lot of covert operations that included assassination of Nazi leaders. But when Truman was contemplating including the development of what we call the Central Intelligence Agency under the umbrella of the National Security Act, he did not want the agency to be involved in these type of black ops or assassination. He wanted it to be a place where all the intelligence would come in and the CIA analysts would decipher it and write reports that the president could use to make the best decisions in the interests of American foreign policy. Of course, Allen Dulles and many of Frank Wisner and Richard Helms and many of those people that were part of the OAS during the war, they wanted a more aggressive and active agency that included a lot of these black ops and operations. And they felt that they were very much against the agency just being an intelligence gathering analytical agency. They wanted to be the Office of Strategic Services was.
Right.
And they slowly convinced people, because in the original charter, they were assigned other powers, but they were never really clearly defined. But this was the door that Allen Dulles and his cohorts would walk through. When they got Truman, I think he was duped, and he regretted this for the rest of his life, especially after his friend, President Kennedy, was assassinated. He started writing an op-ed only 7 days after his death, criticizing the CIA and doing all their strange activities that he said was creating much Cold War intrigue. And I don't think it was a coincidence. I think he was writing it because I think he believed that they were involved in Kennedy's death, much like he believed that they were involved in Dag Hammarskjöld's death.
Absolutely.
And he was convinced to sign NFC 10/2, which formalized this idea of plausible deniability, and that the CIA could engage in black ops, and that when they did so, they had to do it in a way that would give the government, the overt government, the ability to deny knowledge of what the covert operations were engaged in. So that was established, and then Allen Dulles was appointed as the CIA director by President Eisenhower. They began to explore, on behalf of corporate power, governments that were interfering with corporate profits and the interests of the United States and the Dulles brothers' desire to develop an American empire. And Dulles, Eisenhower rather basically essentially allowed them to do all kinds of stuff and mushroom the NSA, the CIA, and all these intelligence agencies mushroomed to these huge powers by the end of his administration, such that he got burned by them, and we could go into more detail about what I mean by that. And he decided to include in his farewell address a warning about them and the military-industrial complex and their corporate sponsors. But anyways, Mohammed Mossadegh rose to power in Iran in the early 50s, and he wanted to use the oil resources to help rebuild his country and improve the standard of living for his citizens. Kind of a novel idea. It was kind of very unusual that you'd want to do that, right? And
yeah, really.
In order to do that, he nationalized the oil industry, and it affected the profits of Standard Oil and British Petroleum and a whole host of companies. And of course, as you know, and you guys talked about many times in your show, John Foster Dulles was a partner in the largest Wall Street firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, and they were there in the 20s and 30s, and they represented all these people, so they had connections with everybody, and they were their friends, and they owned stock in him. And his brother Allen Dulles was a senior attorney at that firm too, and he had the same connections, and he had stock in United Fruit and all these oil companies. And they pretty much saw their clients, former clients, and their interests as consistent with the interests of the United States. And so when Mossadegh, who they probably considered a communist for doing this, even though he was a social, they decided they would overthrow his government because he was interfering with all these corporate interests. And Eisenhower agreed with them and gave the okay, and Kermit Roosevelt actually helped them achieve it on the ground in Iran. And they did it at a very low cost, and hardly anybody died, and it was very quiet, and they were able to maintain plausible deniability. Nobody really knew what was going on, and Roosevelt was just so impressed. But during the process, they had talked informally about they might have to assassinate some of the leaders. But nothing was really written down, and there wasn't any other. But when they started Operation PB Success, which was the operation to go after Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, who was doing a similar thing with United Fruit and other companies who had bought up most of the fertile land in Guatemala. He rose to power in the early 50s as well, and he was also a social democrat, and he wanted to use the banana crop and other crops to do the same thing that Mohammad Mossadegh had wanted to do for his people, which was to improve the standard of living for the Guatemalan people. And so the United Fruit had bought all this land, and they had claimed that it was very valuable, and so their taxes were based on the value that they had told the tax collectors what it was worth, and so they hardly got taxed at all. So Jacobo Arbenz basically offered to buy the land back at the value that he said it was, which was very obviously suppressed, and they were appalled by this. And he was basically buying that land back and taking it back for the Guatemalan people. And so United Fruit, who Alan Dulles had close friends with all their leaders, and as I said, owned stock, decided that they would sponsor a coup. President Eisenhower, who was so impressed by the coup in Iran, said, yeah, let's get rid of this lefty commie, and he approved it. And believe it or not, David Atlee Phillips, who was a psychological propagandist expert, he was involved in the operation. Heavily involved in the operation.
Right.
And to make a long story short, they developed a manual for assassination because they felt that if their psychological propaganda plan did not work, that they would have to kill some of the leaders in Guatemala. And they decided that they should develop a formal protocol and procedure for assassination. And they developed this 19-page manual that basically talked about the different types of assassinations, talked about the weapons that could be used and the best circumstances for each weapon. They talked about accidents and how to make them look like an accident. They didn't explicitly talk about suicide, but obviously fake suicides became part of their protocol because much like an accident, they're not investigated by the authorities as thoroughly, right? And the whole idea of an accident is to make it look like they weren't a victim of an assassination, and therefore they could control how people viewed the event. This was just an accident, nothing to look. There's nothing to see here. Let's move on, right? Just an unfortunate event, and
kind of like George the Mornshell down the road, Rick.
Whole bunches. I mean,
yeah, lots
Dorothy Kilgallen, Roger Craig, the Georgia Miraschultz, David Ferry, all these people associated with the Kennedy assassination, all were committing suicide, even though, like Lieutenant Commander William P. Fitzer, John Garrett
Carlos
Underhill,
right?
Yeah, people are committing suicide, even though they had all these reasons to live.
William Polly was another one.
And Bill Corson, who was a significant CIA asset, who was in the know, said that anybody can commit a murder, but it takes an expert to commit a suicide. But anyways, suicide wasn't mentioned. They talked at length about accidents, and they said the best way to have an accident is you have to have somebody fall at least 75 feet onto a hard surface, because that would ensure their death and all this. And so they're talking about all this stuff, like how to use screwdrivers and drugs and guns. And I mean, to think that this is what our leaders were doing behind closed doors is almost appalling and repulsive if you think about it.
Agreed.
Peter Kornblue and another person discovered this 19-page assassination manual, and they published it and wrote about it. And he, just to let you know who he was, he wrote a great book, Bay of Pigs, called The Bay of Pigs Declassified, the secret CIA report on the invasion of Cuba. And that's how I got to know him. It's a great book. Bay of Pigs, and how all the lies that they basically told the president to get him to do it. But in any event, now they had this manual. Now, the CIA, of course, claimed that they weren't going to assassinate anyone. But of course, the list of names, as Peter Kornbluh pointed out, that were potential assassination targets were all redacted from the documents. They were all blacked out. So we don't know who they were. So we don't know if they actually killed some of the people. And of course, Jacarbo Benz died by some suspicious circumstances in a bathtub in Mexico,
Yes.
where some electrical device allegedly fell into his tub. And
Right.
a lot of people that have written about it said there's a lot of circumstances that just don't seem right to them, that just don't sit well with him. So they may not have killed him at the time. They may have actually assassinated him after the fact. And so that was the development of their assassination program. And, they talked about safe assassinations. They talked about using people that were mentally fanatics, a little deranged, terrorist acts. You had to have someone that either had a political grudge or some fanatical beliefs in order to have them do it. And then they had to have very limited ties to the agency, because if they didn't die in the event, like a suicide bomber type, you didn't want them to be able to connect the dots and reveal the agency was involved. So you had to have very limited contacts with them, and nothing could be written down. And they talked about all this stuff.
Rick, we know, Rick, let me just interject here for a second, buddy. We know, from the church committee, that there was a lot of evidence that the CIA was involved in the assassinations of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo and Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. And then there's been other information that's come out with the papers on Operation Celeste that's connecting Alan Dulles in the CIA to the assassination of Dag Hammarskjöld. So it's there's no doubt that no matter what they say, the CIA has assassinated. I mean, that I don't think how anybody could deny that, that they've been involved in assassinations.
And in fact, we have a lot of information now. Stephen Kinzer, a former New York journalist, wrote a book called about the Dulles brothers and their secret world war,
Right.
in which he said that in this, with Colonel Leroy Fletcher talked about the secret team. I think he was referring to this team that Eisenhower created under NSC 5412/2.
Right.
Which only a select few people participated in, and the CI director obviously was there, and John Foster Dulles. And Johnson, he was one of the people that were in charge of transcribing the minutes. He was the one that heard Eisenhower say, "Take out Patrice Lumumba," and he was so shocked by it, and he knew that it shouldn't be in the minutes. This was clearly top secret, and he shouldn't include it in the minutes, but he was so shocked by it, it was ingrained in his memory. And then, of course, Alan Dulles was told to saw off Castro, and he knew that was an assassination. And then Richard Bissell testified to all this, Pike committees. And John Newman came up with evidence that the United States was involved in the CIA in his death, and it was kind of a trifecta by Eisenhower. And he's the only president that we actually have some really good evidence that he ordered the assassination of these three people.
Right.
And two of them, they were successful. And of course, Castro somehow miraculously survived all the attempts.
Right.
But we also know that Nixon talked about it in the secret tape recordings. He talked about killing syndicated columnist Jack Anderson,
Right.
and they probably ordered the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile, who was killed.
Yes. Right.
And David Sanchez Morales, the hitman for the CIA, admitted he was in the palace at the time.
Right. Rick, let me ask you this question, because this is something that's always troubled me, and my answer to my own belief on this is kind of evolved with discussions with Lisa Peace over the years or over the months on this subject. But we established that the United States, CIA specifically, but other military intelligence, they have these assassination programs. They have trained assassins. They have snipers. They have different ways. They have weapons. They have ways of making it look like a suicide and this and that. Why in the world would do you think the CIA and Allen Dulles would go to the mafia to try to take out Fidel Castro? Because tactically, to me, somebody who's studied organized crime and understands how American Cosa Nostra works and what they're capable of and what they're not capable of, tactically that makes zero sense, because these guys are not snipers. They're the typical mob hit is one best friend shooting the other in the back of the head because he has access to the victim. I mean, that's a typical mob hit. Like, tactically, it makes no sense to bring in a mafia. Why do you believe that Dulles brought the mafia in to try to assassinate Fidel Castro?
I think they were using proxies because they thought that if the mob had killed Castro or any of the other leaders, they had all kinds of interests that would show motive, because Castro was interfering with all the money they were making through the drug routes that went through Cuba, the brothels, and of course the casinos and stuff that were in Havana. And so they had a motive, and the CIA felt that they could plausibly deny any involvement, that it was just the mob, they did it, and they were pissed because they lost all this money, and they wanted their stuff back, because Castro shut down the brothels, and I think he shut down all the casinos. Well,
Rick, that's true.
They also had lethal assets in the country that the CIA did not have at the time. People that were willing to risk their life to kill these people, and so I think they saw it as sort of a pragmatic solution to a problem. Kill them as quickly as possible. And of course, a lot of this stuff turned in, and they kind of looked like the Keystone Cops. They tried all these weird James Bond type of deaths. They tried to put some sort of disease on one of his wetsuits, so that when he put it on, he'd lose all his hair, and he developed cancer or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even Amlash, Quibella was handed some sort of pen or something that was supposed to kill him. But the mob was the easy way. Like you said, they'd go up and just shoot somebody, and then if they got caught and they tried to say, like Jack Ruby tried to say, that it was bigger than him, nobody believed them, and because they had so much motive to kill him. It's the same as they used proxies. Elijah Muhammad against Malcolm X, they used his group as a proxy to kill Malcolm X.
Right.
Because they also had motives to get rid of Malcolm X, so it would be easy to show an opportunity.
Right, and that's but they're a little closer to home than going into Cuba, But the conversation I had with Lisa Peace, I told her that I believe originally the reason that the Dulles used the mafia is because he didn't really care whether it succeeded or not. Originally, his motive was to push Castro into a corner where he only had one place to turn, and that would be the Soviet Union. And then you would have an enemy, 90 miles, off the shores of the United States, connected directly to the Soviet Union, and then he could push the Cold War agenda, But then Lisa Peace said, I think it was more than that. It was just that, they needed a fall guy. They needed the mob to blame, if something did happen. And I think
both of you were right, Sean.
Right.
I think you're both right. The CIA doesn't do things without contingency planning.
Absolutely.
And a lot of thought goes into these programs and operations.
Sure.
And James Jesus Angleton and the top people in the CIA, I mean, a lot of people, like even my uncle, dismissed the CIA as a bunch of idiots. I don't think they were a bunch of idiots. I think they were extremely intelligent, and they were good at what they did.
Oh, I agree. And Rick,
they assigned it. Yeah, but I think they assigned it to the mob. If they killed them, great. They'd use plausible deniability. Right. We didn't know they wanted to get rid of them to get their money back, and people would buy that. But I also think, and I think, if you're right, which you may be, their contingency plan was to create a Cuban missile crisis. And maybe one of their great achievements was they almost got Kennedy in a corner to force him to invade Cuba and take them all out.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then the military could have taken out the Soviet Union because the Strategic Air Command
Absolutely.
projects that they were waiting for, which Khrushchev handed them on a silver platter to take out Russia and China.
Right. Absolutely.
So you may be right that the CIA almost fulfilled their destiny, their ultimate achievement, not only getting rid of Castro, but the Soviet Union and all the communist powers.
And Rick, one thing there, you talked about how the CIA loves to portray that as, we were like the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And yeah, we tried maybe to assassinate these guys and we couldn't get it done. Like, please give me a break. That's the most efficient killing machine the world has ever known, in my opinion, is the CIA. And when they wanted somebody gone, I mean, the only misses they had was really Fidel Castro and maybe Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. But when they honed in on somebody, they were either removed from power or they were assassinated. I mean, they had a pretty good kill rate, probably 99%.
Well, if you look at what they did in Indonesia, they had a kill list.
Right.
That they gave General Suharto and his assigned death squads.
Yes.
And they, according to William Blum, they would check off the names as they were murdered. They had, of course, the whole thing got out of control and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. But they had like 1,000 or more people on that list they wanted taken out because they were the leadership of the left. So,
right, and
PTI, as we've discussed before, were not a bunch of communists. Once again, they were like the Viet Cong. They were a bunch of peasants that wanted independence. Yeah, they were nationalists. They may have had communists within their ranks, but essentially they were nationalists. And that's what Soprano told Kennedy.
I heard it was closer to like 1 million, maybe even 1.5 million on the PKI that was eliminated. And like you said, they were peasants and they were just slaughtered, and a lot of them were garroted. And anybody who's ever seen a mob movie knows what garroted is. I mean, it was basically a wire around the neck. I mean, it was just vicious way these people were slaughtered. And another thing is Operation Phoenix in Vietnam was similar to Rick, because they had a hit list there too, that they were killing people that were on, that were on that list.
That was involved in some of that. They would have people in helicopters and throw somebody out of the helicopter and say, "You want to be next? You better tell us what's going on." That's what they did. It was brutal. I mean,
and of course, Lansdale,
and that was the fear. That was the fear that everybody had when they created the CIA, the people that objected to it, was that it would become an American Gestapo, a SOVAC within the United States, and it'd be a secret police force. And essentially, they have become a secret police force. Most of the world considers the CIA the biggest and most powerful secret police force in the world. And if you know what they mean by secret police, it's not a compliment. It's not a description. It's a very negative comment about what's happened to our country and what the CIA has done to our reputation. They have left us a legacy of ashes. And a lot of people hate us because of what the CIA has done to their countries. But to get back to the assassination quickly, so we don't leave out some important stuff, William Harvey was brought in. He was brought in to actually get Castro and their people. And the order was, ZR Rifle was the kryptonite on Task Force W, and he decided to hide it in Staff D, which was Signet, which was a highly classified unit inside the CIA. Yes.
Right.
And so he thought it was a good place to hide. And he kind of amended that 19-page manual. He talked about if you're going to kill somebody, you got to backdate their 201 files, all the things that looked like what they did to Lee Harvey Oswald. he talks
Oswald.
about in that
Yeah,
manual.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
201 fake
Yep.
201 files on him. They were backdating stuff, just like he said, to blame the Czechs or the Soviets for the assassination.
Yeah.
As
Kill
they
one
tried
enemy
to
and
do.
blame another enemy. Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's right. So that's how the assassination developed, and obviously there was a lot of programs that developed out of that. MK Ultra, the Phoenix program, Operation Gladio, which was NATO. They had assassination teams, so it just sort of infected
In Italy.
all our security apparatus, and it became part of our protocol. And in many ways, I think it's undermined our integrity and our moral standing in the world significantly.
I agree, Rick. And then let's move on into how did it evolve into the drone assassination program? How did that evolve?
Well, I mean, when we started to get heavily involved in the Middle East, and oil became the new gold. You know, you had the gold rush of the 19th century. Now you had the oil rush. And Jimmy Carter, the Carter Doctrine, made oil a national security interest. And of course, so they started focusing on the Middle East quite significantly and developing all kinds of plans, of which 3 Days of Condor was kind of about, you know. I don't know if you remember the movie with Robert Redford. I highly recommend it for you guys that are into
definitely,
this stuff.
yes.
It was a great movie. They stumbled over a war plan, and his whole outfit, his unit, was murdered. And so they started to do all these war plans. They started getting involved in the Middle East, and they'd already started to overthrow the governments. They'd done that in 1953 with Iran, and they were doing it with other governments. And, you know, initially they were using cruise missiles. That was the big technology, if you remember those. They'd fly under radar, and they go after a target, and they'd blow it up. And then the drones started to appear in the late 90s. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. But before 9/11, I don't know if you've heard these talks by General Wesley Clark. He was told that there were plans to take out 7 countries. And essentially, we've invaded and taken out about 5 of them: Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon. Lebanon and Iran are the only ones in Syria. Lebanon and Iran are the 2 left. But anyways, 9/11 occurred, and of course, they wanted to go after these terrorists. And the Bush and Cheneys started to use these drones to go into sovereign airspace and secretly kill what they considered were enemy combatants or terrorists. Unfortunately, they were killing a lot of innocent civilians. And Barack Obama came in, and instead of doing an analysis to determine their efficacy and whether this was a good idea for the United States to be engaged in this type of thing, expanded the drone program significantly. So much so that Jeremy Scahill and some Intercept staffers wrote a famous book called The Assassination Complex, in which they said it was going to tarnish Obama's legacy significantly. And essentially, Obama normalized the assassination programs as a legitimate tool to achieve our foreign policy objectives. He even killed 2 American citizens. Now, these American citizens, if you go by the narrative of the intelligence community, they joined some terrorist organizations that wanted to kill Americans, okay? But nevertheless, they were American citizens. All the constitutional rights that apply to you and I should apply to them. They were murdered. One of them was a teenager. But where's their due process? And so, it got out of control. And the reason why I mention this program is because this is a CIA program that is supported by the military. And the president is very much involved. So, we talked about Eisenhower. Actually, I guess I should amend my statement, because the drone program has implicated George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. They're all assassinating people. Now, some of the people that they're assassinating, you may not have much empathy for, but Donald Trump killed General Soleimani. He was on a peace mission to try to resolve the differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, the CIA didn't want that. They wanted them pitted against each other, divide and conquer type of thing. So they didn't want that mission to be successful. And so they probably told Trump, you got to get rid of this guy. He's dangerous. And Trump agreed to kill him. But when you look at the guy was actually fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda members in Iraq. And so he wasn't necessarily an enemy of the United States, except he was a general of Iran who was considered by the Bush administration the axis of evil. But, you know, we created this. This is a CIA blowback thing. The CIA got rid of Mohammed Mossadegh, who would have been a great ally for the United States.
Yes, Kennedy wanted to bring him back. Kennedy wanted to bring him back.
Yeah. And instead, we ended up with the Khomeini and their religious clerics taking over in '79 because they got sick of the Shah of Iran, you know, and all the oppressive policies he was engaged in. So, and they've been an enemy of ours ever since.
Rick, you know what this comes down to, Rick? It basically comes down to what we talked about before, where Kennedy was the last president, where he was the last guy that was going to stand up to the military, stand up to the intelligence community, and basically tell them, no, we know, you know, how many times did he turn down combat troops in Vietnam? Like 6 times. You know, when everybody wanted to bomb Moscow during the Cuban Missile Crisis and invade Cuba, he said no. I mean, we haven't seen a president since that would stand up to the military and these hawkish, you know, addicted to war people that are running the military, running the intelligence community. And Kennedy was the last president that would stand up and tell these guys no. And I think all of them know what happened to Kennedy. And this is the reason why none of them will stand up and tell them, like, you know, Obama was apparently said to somebody, you know, when they asked him about what happened to all this hope and change. And he said, you know, well, you saw what they did to the Kennedys and Dr. King. Like, they all know the line that's there, and they're not going to cross that line, Rick.
No. I mean, you can see modern leaders that are under similar. Zelensky, the neo-Nazis in that country said that if he signed a peace agreement, they'd kill him and his family. So, and I think the leaders in this country, they know what happened in the 60s. They know what that means, that you operate within a certain parameters, but if you go outside those parameters, anything can happen to you. And Chucky Schumer basically confirmed this in an interview he did with Rachel Maddow when they were talking about all the, you know, the midnight tweets that Donald Trump used to do, and he was criticizing the CIA and NSA and called them a bunch of idiots, and they didn't know what they were doing. And he said this was a very dangerous thing to do because the intelligence community have 6 ways till Sunday to get back at you. And he thought this was really dumb. Americans should have gone, wait a minute, he's the commander-in-chief. Why would he be fearful of his own intelligence aid? They're supposed to listen to him. No, Chucky Schumer was saying the opposite. You don't cross the intelligence community, because if you do that, you're going to get screwed. And it doesn't matter if you're the president or a senator or a congressman, you're getting screwed. So who's in charge of our government?
Well, Rick, it comes down to, I mean, look at all the stuff Allen Dulles was doing. I mean, he was doing things he never told Eisenhower. He never told Kennedy. He didn't need an approval from the president. I mean, you know, a lot of these things, these assassinations against Castro. I mean, we had Bill Davey on a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about how the Kennedys never approved those assassination attempts on Castro, and they were told that they were stopped, and they didn't stop them. They continued them even after. So the CIA lied right to Kennedy's face and continued those assassination attempts.
It was a lie promoted by Sam Halperin that developed legs of its own, and it spread to all kinds of places. And unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream media and mainstream historians just went with it without really researching it.
And that's
it's kind of
unfortunate, but that's
mystery.
pretty usual. That's not unusual. I mean, we talk about this a lot.
Marilyn
They just go
Monroe
with the
thing,
flow. Yeah.
Marilyn Monroe, the ties that they had with, I mean, if you look at, for example, the grandfather there was supposed to be a bootlegger.
Yeah.
He didn't bootleg.
No,
you
we
know,
talked to Jim DiGino about this.
Yeah, he never bootlegged. I mean,
No.
he became the ambassador to the court of St. James, and he had other very important posts within
Yes, and
the
he was vetted for those.
administration. He was vetted by the FBI and the Senate,
And they
and he
found
had
no
all
mob
kinds
ties.
of enemies.
Right.
He had all kinds of enemies, and if they could prove he was bootlegging in violation of a constitutional
Sure.
amendment, they would have brought it out.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Rick. And none of that came out.
The Kennedys went after the mob like no other group has ever done. I mean,
Right.
they hardly even talk about organized crime today. I mean, I don't even know who the leaders of organized crime are today. Sam Giancana and Marcello, they were household names at some point in the 60s. But these other, no attorney general has made it one of his primary goals to get rid of organized crime since Bobby Kennedy.
No, he was the greatest crime fighter the country ever had, was Bobby Kennedy. And it's insulting to think that, these people say the Kennedys were tied to the mob. That is just the dumbest thing. And the mob would never trust them to begin with. You're thinking that you're calling these mob guys stupid, and these guys at the top are not stupid. They're masters of avoiding self-incrimination, and they know how to split their enemies, and they hated the Kennedys. So there's no way they would go into any alliance with them. But another thing, Rick, is, you talk about the disinformation that Hoover had at the FBI. If he had anything credible on JFK's womanizing, he would have brought that out and he would have used it against them. I mean, Hoover had a lot of disinformation that he was trying to spread on the Kennedys that he knew couldn't really stick because it was all garbage. But if there was anything credible, it would have came out back then.
Part of the Marilyn Monroe thing was all being supported by J. Edgar Hoover, according to William Sullivan, the third leader in the FBI. He was fanning the flames of all these rumors because, they had to destroy the character of the Kennedys to make their deaths look irrelevant and unimportant, and they were just part of the main. They were just two politicians that didn't mean anything. And so they had to assassinate their characters, because if people knew that there was actually a way out of Vietnam, that there was a president that actually had a way of getting out of Vietnam, it would destroy their whole narrative that this was inevitable, you had to do it, and had to defeat the communists. No, there was actually a president that thought differently about the problem and had a different solution. And they couldn't let that come out. But anyways, the Civil War of the 1960s, if you want to get into that.
Let's get into that, Rick.
I can tell two stories that kind of talks about this. One is in 1963, Bobby Kennedy was trying to get J. Edgar Hoover to acknowledge there was organized crime and to get his people to actually help him prosecute them. Up until then, he was working with a lot of intelligence units within the local police departments that knew these people existed and were dealing with them all the time, and even had officers that were killed by him. So he was trying to get the FBI to use all their resources to do that. And Hoover was complaining about the civil rights movement and that there were communists in the ranks of Dr. King's inner circle, and that this was a national security issue, and that these people were being duped by communists. And Robert Kennedy very reluctantly said that, well, I'll give you 30 days to try to prove that there's something going on there. But you have to, after this is done, you're going to have to give your resources and help me fight organized crime. Now, to lay down some more context, Hoover was already surveilling Dr. King, tapping his phones. All he wanted to do was get the Attorney General on board so that he could use him as a fall guy, because he was already doing it. And then the Kennedys knew that this wasn't a good policy. So Jack Kennedy met with Dr. King. And there's a famous meeting with them. And Dr. King indicated that he thought that was strange because the Kennedy, he didn't trust providing him this information that he wanted to tell him in his own office, like his own office could be bugged. So he thought that was weird. But Jack Kennedy basically said what the concerns were, that there were some communists in his ranks, and that he was being bugged and his hotel rooms were being tapped, and that he needed to be very careful. And Dr. King him letting him know, and he understood his concerns about some communism, and because it would undermine the civil rights movement if there were communists, because it would change the whole propaganda campaign against them, and they might lose the public relations war, right? So I think Dr. King, if I'm not mistaken, he got rid of one of the guys, but another one was a very close friend, and he kept him. But he was made aware that this was happening, and of course we all know what happened. John Kennedy was killed, and Robert Kennedy went into a deep depression. That his whole total outlook was derailed for about a year. I mean, he just wasn't. He was so distraught over the death of his brother. While this was going on, and he forgot about these wiretaps, they were continuing. William Sullivan, basically, they were collecting some tapes of some infidelity incidents with Dr. King in some of these hotel rooms. They put them all together, and they sent a package with a cover letter in 1964 indicating that we're going to reveal what they said. It's not coming from me. Your degeneracies, and if you should do the right thing, which many people believe meant you should kill yourself before this stuff is released. Well, Loretta King and Dr. King decided that they weren't going to be bullied by this type of threats, and obviously he didn't stop his civil rights movement. He kept going forward, and he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. So, and then it even goes further, this thing, because Ross, I think from California, he was a Democrat. He'd been fighting for the Freedom of Information Act for a decade. He felt that there was all these things going on in the government that were secret. They were undermining our republic, and they were not in our interests, and they needed to be brought to light, and the public had a right to know. And this guy, Cornelius Gallagher, who was a Democrat from New Jersey and a close friend of Robert Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, he was approached by attorney Roy Cohn, who was of J. Edgar Hoover, who also was the sidekick for Senator McCarthy during his witch hunts in the early 50s. And he told Cornelius Gallagher, one, I want you to come out and blame these wiretaps and this surveillance stuff on Robert Kennedy. And two, we want to stop supporting the Freedom of Information Act. And basically, Cornelius, I think his nickname was Sean, but I could be wrong. He's listed as Cornelius Gallagher, which is kind of a strange name. He basically gave them the middle finger, told them to get the hell out of his office. Well, what happened to him, the Freedom of Information Act got passed, but he was charged with all kinds of corruption, and he had to leave his office and defend himself. So this was the way that Hoover, he had files on everybody. He was intimidating people all over the place. I mean, Gallagher spoke to some of his colleagues, and he said, I thought I had support for you on this bill. And they would go, you know, we got families, and, you know, they told us they were going to release this stuff, and we can't vote. I'm sorry. I can't do it. I can't ruin my career. So this is the way Hoover was attacking the left on Capitol Hill. And fortunately, he lost that particular battle. But just think of all the pieces of legislation that was deep six because of these tactics. And of course, we know COINTELPRO, basically that was originally created to go after alleged communists, was now going after these, what they considered these leftist subversive groups, you know, the Students for a Democratic Committee, the Black Panther for
Black Panthers, yep.
And what they would do is they would infiltrate these groups, and they would pit one group against another inside of them and create all this chaos. And they would also encourage them to engage in criminal acts. And when they engaged in a criminal act, they would get arrested. And then the FBI would say, see, we told you these people were derelicts and criminals. And that's the way it worked. And they were also, as we know with Fred Hampton, involved in assassinating some of these leaders. But Dr. King, essentially, he became a victim of this stuff because he had to operate within certain parameters. And even then, they were very fearful of him and they were trying to destroy him. But he didn't become a subject of assassination until he did what? He came out on April 4th, 1967.
It's the Vietnam War.
In his Riverside Church speech, and he came out against the war. And he said, at some point, silence becomes betrayal. And that betrayal is now come in our relationship with Vietnam. And he gave one of the best anti-war speeches since the American University speech by John Kennedy, which may have sealed his fate, that speech. And I think it sealed his fate because to the exact day, April 4th, 1968, 1 year later, he was killed in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel. No. And there was a trial, a wrongful death trial, in which one of the conspirators who owned a diner in which these people met, kind of like the woman that allowed John Wilkes Booth and his conspirators meet in her lodgings or something, and she was the first woman that was hung by the federal government. I don't know if you know that story.
Yeah, right.
But
I do.
This guy was the same thing. He owned a diner, and these people met and they talked about killing King.
Right, Jowers.
And yes, and in this wrongful death lawsuit, in which James Douglas wrote a great article about because he sat through the whole thing, 70 witnesses testified how the military and other federal agencies, and including the Memphis Police Department, were involved in the conspiracy to kill King, and they won the case. And this standard, wrongful death, is the second highest standard in the legal system. You have the fair preponderance of evidence for civil cases, which is a slight tilting of the scales of justice in your favor. You got 51% of the evidence, you win. In a beyond a reasonable doubt case, almost 98% of the evidence is in your favor, right? But in a wrongful death, the standard is clear and convincing evidence. That's like 75% to 80% of the evidence is in your favor. And so this is what they were doing against the left. They basically decapitated all the charismatic leaders that were influencing and inspiring millions of people, not even at home, around the world. They decapitated all of them. We never fully recovered from that. And until this day, we're still in search of heroes. Absolutely. And so that I called it, because I think by calling it a civil war, everybody knows about a civil war, and they have these images. And I think it was a good way to kind of place it in a certain context for people to understand what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I think that was brilliant, Rick, because you know, you labeled it just what it was, a civil war. And you know, and when you look at it, you know, how these guys were promoting peace, and they were taken out by people who are addicted to war. And, you know, the 5 assassinations, and we're going to include Freddie Hampton, 5 assassinations in the 60s, and then these operations like Chaos, COINTELPRO. And then I even, in the episode we did on Charles Manson, I threw that in. I said that was kind of like the knockout punch where they had the left on the ropes. And Charles Manson, who I'm convinced was, you know, a member that, you know, he was involved with the MK Ultra program and then was weaponized, you know, as under Operation Chaos, and used to go after the Hollywood left wing and the anti-war movement. And I think that was like kind of the final blow, the knockout punch against the left. And like you said, haven't recovered since.
Yeah, I listened to that podcast, and there was very compelling evidence that he had a lot of connections with people that were running the MK Ultra experiments in San Francisco and other places. And I also didn't realize that Sharon Tate was such a political activist.
Yeah, and Abigail Folger too.
At the time, I was a very young child, but I just thought of her as a beautiful actress that did movies. I didn't realize that she was very involved in political activism, and her house was a center of all kinds of activities from the left in Hollywood.
Right. And Mae Brussel talked about that too as well. But Abigail Folger was another one, Rick, that was heavily active into activism. And I think Tom O'Neill did a better job with his research in the book than he thinks he did, because I think he said he was, he wasn't set in the conclusions and this and that, but I think he did a great job. And I absolutely think, there's too much coincidence when Manson goes into that clinic in San Francisco where there's so many doctors connected to MK Ultra, and he's a common criminal with nothing to suggest that he would become this charismatic cult leader. And he comes out of there, as like Vince Bugliosi said, the monster that can control people's minds and have the, people that were violent do all these violent acts. That's pretty much what MK Ultra's goal was. So I'm absolutely convinced that Manson was a part of that.
In addition to the character assassinations of Colonel Leroy Fletcher Prouty and James Garrison, you have the deaths that I haven't researched enough to be able to say too much about them. Allard Lowenstein, the former congressman who was a good friend of RFK, and then
right.
He advocated for reopening the RFK assassination case. And Hale Boggs, whose airplane disappeared in '73, who was one of the critics of the Warren Commission, and he was on the Warren Commission. He was the one that talked to James Garrison and said, I didn't believe in the single bullet theory, and I thought that the FBI and the CIA were lying to us on a lot of stuff. And got Garrison back involved in the case. And his plane disappeared over Alaska in 1973, and nobody's found the wreckage.
Yeah, absolutely, Rick. This has been amazing stuff. I know we kept you here a long time, and I didn't mean to cut in there a couple of times there, Rick. I get fired up with this stuff because it's so insulting, that what happened in the way, the country's really been hijacked by these assassinations, and we haven't recovered. And it just it pisses me off, to be honest with you, and that's why I get a little bit fired up. So I didn't mean to interrupt you there, and a couple of times I got a little bit out of hand there, buddy.
No, I like your input. It just adds more context because there's so much to remember. It's helpful when the interviewer actually knows about some of it and can add their own insights and additional information, and it just makes it more interesting, I think, for the listener.
Well, is there anything, Rick, that you want to cover that we didn't? Because certainly, you're welcome back. We'd love to have you back, and there's a lot more to discuss. But anything that you think for this episode that you want to mention that we haven't yet?
Just that I failed to talk about the fact that the drone assassination. Two things about the drone assassination program. One, even Alan Dulles and Richard Helms and Richard Bissell, they understood that assassination was completely immoral, and that the general public at the time would never tolerate it. So their assassination programs were highly classified secret operations that most presidents and the Congress and most of our leaders had no idea that they were involved in them. And the drone assassination program has been openly discussed from one administration to the next. They don't even hide it. They do it right out in front. And Barack Obama used to say we'd meet on Friday, and we'd discuss who our targets were, and we'd send the drones after them. And unfortunately, a lot of what they call the military euphemism is collateral damage. Well, the collateral damage, and most of the people that are killed by the drone assassination program are not enemies of the United States. They're individual innocent bystanders and friends, and we're creating more enemies than we can kill. And one of the examples I give is there was this exchange student from Yemen, Muslimi, and he decided to become a U.S. citizen because he loved it here, and he got his college degree here, and he'd go back to his homeland in Yemen, and they had a fairly negative view of the United States because unlike what Kennedy wanted to project, instead of a man with a gun, a Peace Corps worker, they viewed the United States as just an extension of their military and the CIA. And he said, no, Americans are really good people, and America's much more than that. It's a great place, and I really enjoy it there, and I've learned a lot, and people are nothing like their government. And then a drone strike hit that village. And of course, Barack Obama said they got this enemy combatant, but they knew it got grandmothers, it got sisters, brothers, and everything he had done over years to convince them the United States was a good country was totally ruined by one drone strike. And so this is the damage these assassination programs are doing to us. And we really need to rethink. We need to get control of the CIA. And if we can't make it into just an analytical agency, we need to abolish it. As Stephen Kangas said, we need, the CIA is out of control. Either turn it into an analysis agency like the original founders wanted it to be, President Truman, or we need to get rid of it because it's ruining our moral standing in the world and it's undermining our principles. We're becoming just like our enemies. And so I think that this program has been a disaster. And then, Daniel Hale, the whistleblower on this that revealed how all these people were being killed by the drone, he goes to prison. And the people that are running these murderous operations are getting awards and being, promoted. It's just everything is turned upside down.
Yeah, it's ass backwards.
Yes, that's all I wanted to close with, other than the fact that I had a great conversation with you guys. I enjoyed it very much, and I really appreciate you allowing me to be on.
Well, thanks, Rick. I mean, this was fantastic, and we're gonna love to have you back because there's a lot more that we got to discuss, and like you said, something's got to change here. This has gone on far too long, and it's got to change if we're gonna move forward as a country. But
I do have some good news though for you and Bill.
Go ahead.
David Talbot was interviewed by Glenn Greenwald, and he said he wrote a transcript, or a script rather, for Oliver Stone about Vietnam, and Oliver Stone's doing a movie. Have you heard that?
Oh,
No, he's doing a movie on Vietnam.
Yeah, I think about the fact that Kennedy was withdrawing and how Johnson turned everything around 180%. And he said Oliver Stone is really invested in this, and he thinks he can make a movie out of it. He wrote the script, much like James DiEugenio wrote the script for the documentary.
Right.
So,
well, that's awesome because
I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are. If you need to find it, you can go on Glenn, or you can go on my timeline and get more information on it. But the whole interview is on Rumble. Only a partial interview is on YouTube. And I had to go on Rumble to listen to it.
Well, to me, that's one of the most important stories that need to get out because, that's where academia failed. And of course, the mainstream media where they push this myth that isn't true that, Kennedy got us into Vietnam. And we did a whole episode on that where we talked about, we were involved when the French were there long before Kennedy. And back in 80% of the money funded into the French, back in the French. And it was all about colonialism, and that's what it came down to. And so, I mean, this would be, it's such an important story to understand the direction that was changed when Kennedy's body is still in a casket there the Monday after the assassination, and Johnson changes that NSAM, and basically the direction of the whole war has changed. And Kennedy was pulling out the advisors, and everything changed. And it's such an important story that people need to know. And of course, academia failed miserably by pushing the myth that nothing changed between Kennedy and Johnson, and the truth is that everything changed. So that's a failure by academia, and that's would be an important story. And I hope Oliver gets it out, because it's something that's got to be said. So all right, Rick, we're gonna wrap it up, and I know. Go ahead, Rick.
I was just saying, thank God for Oliver Stone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another guy who's been attacked by the mainstream media for pretty much just telling the truth,
right.
You don't get prosecuted for lying on behest of the power elite. You get telling the truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nope.
Absolutely. So I know, Bill, your voice is shot there, buddy, so I'll wrap this up. Rick, thanks for coming on. This has been fantastic. And thank you very much. And that's enough out of you, everybody. Good night.
All right. Good night. That's Enough Out of You podcast is executive produced and written by Bill Rader and Sean Kane, and edited by Bill Rader. The That's Enough Out of You podcast and logo are exclusive property of Bags of Chicken, LLC. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or accounts of this podcast without the express written consent of Bags of Chicken, LLC is prohibited. So don't even try it.